Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. Now, as Muslims, we know, and it's our belief, that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has given us a complete and a comprehensive deen. We know the famous verse of the Quran which was revealed at the time of Hajjatul Wida. اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. So often we hear our ulama and our scholars tell us that Islam is not a religion. Islam is a way of life. It gives you guidelines, it gives you guidance, it gives you regulations, it gives you rules for every aspect of your existence, from the time you are born up to the time that you leave this world, your public life, your private life, commercial dealings, social interaction and etiquette, everything complete. There's nothing that a human is expected to do or has to encounter, except that they are rulings and that they are broad principles and that there's guidelines from the side of the Sharia. And that is the beauty of this deen of Islam. In this regard, we are going to be discussing a very important topic, perhaps something that we don't discuss as often on this type of a program, and that is Islamic economic principles with a particular focus on car business and car dealers. So what does Islam say about economics? What are the principles that Muslim businessmen are expected to be guided by when we hear about Islamic finance or Islamic banking or a Sharia compliant product or a Sharia compliant transaction? What does all of this mean? No matter who you are or what profession you are in or what line of work you are in, these kind of things are something that you have to deal with all the time, because money and transaction is something that no one can escape. So it's central in that sense to all of our lives. Our guest on the program today to discuss this issue is Mufti Shafique Jakhura. Mufti Sahib, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the program once again.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Moulana, and assalamu alaikum to all the viewers of Hilaal TV today.
So I had mentioned in my introduction, Mufti Sahib, that Islam is a complete way of life. The Sharia gives us those guidelines that can guide us, those principles from which we can deduce rulings to deal with any situation. Perhaps that's a good place to start. It's a very common word. Every Muslim knows this word, Sharia. What does it mean? Where does the word originate from?
Jazakumullah, and it's very important for us to understand what Sharia is, where when we speak about Sharia compliance, where are these things that we establish Sharia compliance from, where are they founded? All of these things are very, very central to this particular theme. But even before we go there, I just want to touch on the importance of Islamic economics in the life of a Muslim, Islamic commercial activity in the life of a Muslim, and the great importance that Islam has laid on those particular principles, on those particular aspects. In the words of my honorable Ustad and the great luminary and actually Shaykhul Islam Hazrat Moulana Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani Sahib, Damat Barakatuhum, he mentions that if you look at it, the irony is that many a times we keep economic activity and commercial activity out of religion. Whereas he says there's an irony, on every dollar bill you have something that's written, "In God we trust." Every dollar bill. If you look at the $1 bill, the $5 bill, the $10 bill, the $20 bill, the $100 bill, each of it says, "In God we trust." Yet when it comes to earning and spending those dollars, we hardly consult in the rules or guidelines of that God whom we claim we trust in. So it's a big irony. It's something that not only Muslims, but everyone across all religious denominations need to look at, that do we consult in that God whom we claim we trust in when it comes to earning our wealth and spending that wealth. And the hadith actually states that, and this, from here you can gauge the importance that Islam has given to earning correctly and spending correctly, and effectively commercial and economic activity. So the hadith clearly states that لَن تَزَالَ قَدَمَا إِبْنُ آدَمَ حَتَّى يُسْأَلَ عَنْ خَمْسٍ, that the feet of man will not move on the day of judgment, will not move on the day of Qiyamah until he is asked 5 questions. And 2 of those 5 questions, which amounts to 40% of the questions, will be عن ماله من أين اكتسب وفيما أنفق, about his money, how he earned it, where he spent it. So these are very, very important aspects, and something that perhaps we do not give the importance that should be given to these particular aspects. Nevertheless, I think we'll discuss more on that aspect as we go forward. Coming back to the issue of Sharia. What is Sharia? Where does it find itself? What are the sources of Sharia? It's important for us to understand this. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned the word Sharia in one particular verse of the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Jathiyah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَى شَرِيعَةٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْرِ فَاتَّبِعْهَا وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَ الَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. And the translation of that verse is that then, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we have placed you, جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَى شَرِيعَةٍ, upon a Sharia. We have placed you upon a Sharia. And here, the lexical meaning of the word Sharia, or the dictionary meaning of the word Sharia, is a plain way, a straight path. We have placed you upon a straight path. فَاتَّبِعْهَا, so follow that straight path. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَ الَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, and do not follow the desires of those who do not know. So it's a very simple translation of the verse. But if you contemplate over it, you ponder over it, you reflect over it, it tells you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a particular path to tread upon. And if we are not treading upon that particular path, then we are actually following desires of those who do not know. Those may be our desires, or we are falling into the trap of following the desires of other people. And that is, of course, even worse. But the point is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a Sharia, a straight path. From there, the scholars have deduced that the lexical meaning of Sharia is a straight path, a plain way, and the technical meaning of it is divine law. Now, where does this divine law come from? And how does it affect us, and where does it fit into the whole equation? So perhaps we should take a moment and reflect. You know, there is a verse of the Holy Quran in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاللَّهُ أَخْرَجَكُم مِّن بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا. Allah caused you to be born, He caused you to come out of the wombs of your mothers, and you knew absolutely nothing. There was no question of knowledge, there was no ilm that we had, there was no information that we had at that stage. And then, وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then blessed us with sources of knowledge. And those primary sources of knowledge that Allah blessed us with were our 5 senses. We looked at something, we learnt about it, we gained knowledge about it. We heard something, we learnt about it. We felt and touched something, we learnt about it. So through these 5 senses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us a lot of knowledge. And we are very much reliant on these great ni'mats and bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with. But no matter how much we desire to earn and gain knowledge purely through these 5 senses, the scope within which they work is very, very limited. We cannot gain knowledge of everything purely with the 5 senses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has then blessed us with a secondary source of knowledge, and that is our desire, our reasoning. Our reasoning is a secondary source of knowledge. And sometimes there's this misconception that we are not encouraged in the Sharia to use our reasoning. And that's a complete misconception. We should be using our reasoning. We should be trying to delve into the ahkam of Sharia, understand the hikmat and the wisdom. Yes, The only consideration is that, look, if we don't understand the reasoning, the hikmah, the wisdom behind a certain rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a certain guideline of the Sharia, then our implementing and practicing upon it is not dependent upon whether we have understood the reasoning behind it or not. So we are still going to practice upon it, but we are still encouraged to use our reasoning, to still delve and dive into the depths of hikmah and wisdom, the beauty of the Quran and so forth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us then with a secondary source of knowledge, and that is our reasoning. Because we can't get all sorts of knowledge purely on the basis of our five senses. We have to apply our mind, use our reasoning, use our intellect. It's a great ni'mat and bounty, and we traverse through the journey of life in that particular manner. Then, just as how our five senses are limited, even our sense of reasoning is very limited in the scope in which it works. It's very, very limited. It is, we can never reach an agreed scale of value on issues. There is always going to be a difference of opinion in matters. And therefore, we need someone to guide us and to say that, look, this is the guideline. Your reasoning must be confined within this particular area. You cannot allow it to go beyond that. And this is something that has been even, it's been approved even by, and it's been attested to even by, modern day non-Muslim scholars of jurisprudence and so forth, that they have also accepted that. And that is when divine knowledge then comes into play. Where the scope of reasoning ends, that is where divine knowledge comes into place. And divine knowledge is essentially the Sharia that we speak about. And the sources of the Sharia are the Quran and the Sunnah as primary sources. The Holy Quran is a primary source. A secondary source, the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, beyond that, and sometimes we don't realize, there are other sources of the Sharia that are beyond the Quran and the Sunnah, and that is ijma of the scholars. And there's different levels of ijma. It may not be the occasion to go into all of those details, but a consensus of the scholars. If the scholars reach consensus or something, that becomes a source of the Sharia. And even beyond that, ijtihad, applying your mind, analytical reasoning, all of that, that is a source of the Sharia. And maybe I just want to touch on it very briefly.
Yeah.
How it becomes a source is, look, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam had sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal, the great Sahabi, the great companion of Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam. He was sending him over to Yemen, and he asked him, "Oh Mu'adh, you are going to," and it's a very, very sort of emotional moment in the history of Islam. Mu'adh ibn Jabal is leaving him, and Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam is saying to him that perhaps when you come back, you may not meet me, you'll pass by my qabr and my home. So it's a very emotional moment. And on that occasion, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam asked him, "You're going to Yemen. I'm appointing you as the Amir of the people of Yemen. How will you deal with them? How will you pass judgment?" So Mu'adh says, "I will pass judgment with them in accordance with the Quran." And Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam says, "And if you don't find the solutions in the Quran, then what will you do?" He says that then I will go into the hadith, the interactions that I've had with you, other Sahaba I've had with you. I will ask them, go into the hadith, the Sunnah, and I will find solutions and rule and judge between the people in that particular manner. And Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam said to him, "And if you don't find specific answers in the Sunnah, then what will you do?" So he says, "Ajtahidu bi ra'yi." Then I will apply my mind on the principles that you have taught us, and I will find a solution for the ummah. And that this is regarded as a founding stone for the concept of ijtihad and analytical reasoning. And it is regarded actually as a source of the Sharia. And this sort of ijtihad happens on a daily basis in the fatwa departments around the world. It happens in the Islamic fiqh academies. It happens in institutions like IOFI, the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions, where something may not be very clear in the Quran and the Sunnah, and there's new scenarios that come about, And the beauty is that our deen and our sharia has a solution to all those issues, because we have the usul and the principles upon which we can apply our minds and deduce rulings. So it may not be the forte of any individual scholar, but there is a concept of al-ijtihadul juma'i that happens, collective ijtihad that happens among scholars internationally, and they apply their minds. And that is what we speak about as sharia. Sharia is this, things that are deduced from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from Ijma' and Qiyas. I'm so sorry for this very long introduction, but
No,
it's
it's fine.
very important that when we speak about Sharia compliance, we understand it in the right context.
No, Jazakumullah for that, Mufti Saab. Very comprehensive and very enlightening. So, coming to the core of the topic, then, what would you say are some of the basic Islamic economic principles?
So some of the very basic Islamic economic principles. Number one is that we believe in divine guidance. This is core. Any business person must believe that we have divine guidance. There's no such thing as commercial activity, economic activity is divorced from religion. There's no such thing like that. We are, and this is so important. In fact, I just want to maybe touch on this. Someone asked Imam Muhammad, rahmatullah alayh, the great student of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, and a very great student of his, and he is perhaps the reason of the collection of the Hanafi mazhab, because he has collected the Hanafi mazhab through his various writings and so forth. And he's written 6 famous kitabs: Jami' Kabir, Jami' Saghir, Siyar Kabir, Siyar Saghir, Ziyadat, Mabsut. These are 6 famous kitabs that he has written. And someone asked Imam Muhammad rahmatullah alayh, have you not written anything about tasawwuf and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now look at the response, and this is what I want our viewers to understand. He said that my kitabul buyu is my kitab on tasawwuf. Subhanallah. It's something to really reflect over. He said that my chapter on trade and economic transactions is actually my chapter on your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is so important because it shows us that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spirituality, is not divorced from religion. In fact, in order to enhance and get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our commercial and economic activity has to be in line with the guidelines of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the teachings of the Sharia. So that is key. Divine guidance and belief in divine guidance is very, very key for us to move ahead. We engage in economic activities in accordance with the guidelines that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam has set forth for us. And just to give our viewers a little bit of idea on that, we study a book of jurisprudence, advanced jurisprudence, when we do the alim course, in the Hanafi mazhab I'm speaking about. But this goes, you would remember, Moulana, we studied over 2 years, we studied the Hidayah, Al-Hidayah. Yes. And it's 4 volumes, you study it over 2 years. And only one volume deals with our ibadat. Only one volume deals with our ibadat. Only one volume deals with our salah, zakat, hajj, som, and so forth. The rest of the volumes, a large chunk of it deals with our economic and commercial activity. And that is so important. And it just shows the importance that our deen, the scholars, the jurists, the Quran, the hadith have given us with regards to our economic, our commercial activity. So the belief in divine guidance is very, very key. The longest verse in the Quran speaks to commercial transactions. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha tadayantum bidaynin ila ajalin musamman faktubuh. Allah speaks about tijarat and trade in the Quran. If it was divorced from spirituality and from the teachings of deen, then it wouldn't have been there in the Quran. And the importance that has been given is proof enough that we as Muslim traders, Muslim business people, must take that to heart. Then another Islamic economic principle is the fact that Islam accepts the natural forces of supply and demand. We don't believe in a planned economy like how the socialists or the communists believe in. We don't believe in a planned economy. Islam accepts the natural forces of supply and demand. On one occasion, the Sahaba had asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to fix the price of certain items. And there is occasion where a Muslim government can fix the price of certain items. That's in its place. But on this particular occasion, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam told the Sahaba, Da'un nas yarzuqullahu ba'duhum ba'da. Leave the people, Allah provides some of them through some others. This was a subtle indication to the forces of supply and demand. And then he says, Inna Allah huwa al-raziq al-qabid al-basit. So look at these words that he chose to use. Allah is the one who gives sustenance, right? And then he is qabid, he is the one who reduces the supply of something. Al-basit, he is the one who increases the supply or the demand of something. So all of these things indicate that Islam, these are natural forces which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created in the marketplace, and Islam recognizes that, and that's a key Islamic economic principle that we adhere to. Islam also recognizes the factors of production in Islam, and those who have studied economics will understand that there are various factors of production. Economics 101 tells you land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. These are the factors of production. They participate in the growth of wealth. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. So the modern economic principles state that land must get a rental, labor gets a wage, capital gets interest, and the entrepreneur gets the profit. So Islam recognizes that land must get a rental. Islam recognizes that labor must get a wage. Islam does not recognize that capital must get interest separately. If you provide capital, you are an entrepreneur, essentially, and you are entitled to the profits. But broadly speaking, the factors of production, Islam recognizes that, and that's very important for us to understand. Islam also recognizes the rights to profit motive, private ownership. These are aspects that we have to embrace. And, we all, as the Ummah of Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, a great majority of the Ummah recites Surah Yasin. There's a verse in Surah Yasin in which Allah says, أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا أَنَّا خَلَقْنَا لَهُم مِّمَّا عَمِلَتْ أَيْدِينَا أَنْعَامًا. Do they not see that we have created with our hands cattle for them, فَهُمْ لَهَا مَالِكُونَ, and they are the owners of this cattle. So Islam recognizes private ownership. It recognizes the right and the inclination that there is towards earning profits, profit motive. Unlike a sort of capitalist state or communist state which believes in a planned economy. So these things, Islam recognizes these things, but none of these things are unbridled. When Islam recognizes there are conditions that are there are guidelines that have been set in place, and perhaps these guidelines can be outlined in three broad categories. Number one is divine guidelines. These divine guidelines exist in the aspects of the prohibition of interest, for example, the prohibition of entering into speculative transactions, into commercial transactions in which there is a large amount of gharar and uncertainty. So these are very, very key aspects. The aspects of prohibition of dealing in haram products or services, impermissible products or services, like alcohol, like pork, like prostitution, like pornography. These are all divine guidelines that are in place that will guide our right to profit, our right to private ownership. They will guide us in as far as our economic and commercial activity is concerned. Then there is the concept and the aspect of regulations that have been placed by a government. If a government puts in certain regulations, and the Islamic State puts in certain regulations, then those regulations and those guidelines are to be upheld. So, for example, in the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, it has been mentioned that there was a pandemic, a sickness that was spreading in the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and medical practitioners, and it's nice to note that medical practitioners had identified that the cause of spread was due to watermelons. And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu at that stage had prohibited the sale of watermelons, which is otherwise permissible and acceptable. So the sale of watermelons is permissible and acceptable in normal circumstances, but when there is a reason for the Islamic government to curtail or prohibit the sale of that, then it is binding upon the subjects of that area, of that government, to adhere to those guidelines as well. So that is the second aspect. And of course, for Muslim traders, for Muslim businessmen, there is also the concept of moral considerations. And I like to refer to it as ROIH. You know, business people know what ROI is. ROI generally refers to return on investments. ROIH refers to return on investment in the hereafter. So that's also a consideration that we adopt. It's not only your return on investment in this world that we look after. So they might be, for example, they might be two perfectly halal, permissible business ventures that one could apply one's capital and resources to. One of them is an educational institute in which the returns are mediocre, and the other is a perfectly halal entertainment theme park in which there's tremendous returns and great potential. But just because there's great potential or great ROI, a Muslim investor doesn't only look at that. He also looks at the impact that his investment is going to have on society at large and the return that he's going to earn in the hereafter. And that is very, very key and an important Islamic economic principle that we need to give thought to as well.
You are watching the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. We are speaking to Mufti Shafique Jakhura about Islamic economic principles, and we intend to talk a little bit more about how that relates and impacts on businessmen who are involved in the car trade. So Mufti, just building on from what you've said, right, Islamic commercial and financial principles and the different types, and then obviously going on to what is a central issue, and you've made reference to it already a few times, and that is riba, the Arabic word which we normally commonly refer to as interest.
So riba is one of the things that has been prohibited, and riba refers to interest. Now, what is the aspect of interest? Where does it come about? The prohibition is very, very clear in the Quran and the Hadith. And perhaps if you were to go into all of it, there hasn't been a sterner warning that has been sounded for any other crime than there has been for consumption of interest, the earning of interest, the charging of interest, the paying of interest. For example, the Holy Quran says, الذين يأكلون الربا لا يقومون إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. And the Quran says in another verse, فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. You know, that the people who consume interest, they will be raised up on the day of judgment in a bewildered state, in a mad state, in the state of junoon, like someone who the devil has touched with his hand and made him bewildered. And if you don't take heed and you don't stop taking interest and don't stop engaging in interest-bearing activity, the Quran says then take notice of a war and a battle with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So very, very severe and stern warnings. And Nabi alayhi salatu wa salam in the hadith has mentioned that لَعَنَ اللَّهُ آكِلَ الرِّبَى وَمُوكِلَهُ وَكَاتِبَهُ وَشَاهِدَيْهِ, that may the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon the one who takes interest, who gives interest, who is the draftsman of a clause of interest, and who signs on who signs off as a witness on an interest-bearing transaction. All of these people have been cursed in the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And not only that, he said that wahum sawa. He said all of these four categories of people are equal in sin. So very, very significant and severe and stern warnings have been sounded about those who engage in interest-based transactions at any level. And therefore it is something that we need to be very much aware about and protect. In some ahadith, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam has said that taking a dirham of interest is worse than committing zina, fornication, or adultery with one's own mother 72, 73 times. These are very, very severe warnings that have been sounded, and something that we need to take very much to heart and be very, very careful. We know that we live in a world in which interest is the order of the day, but we as Muslims, alhamdulillah, there are solutions for us. And where there is a will, there is a way for us to transact in a proper manner without having to be involved in interest-based transactions, without supporting the interest-based system, and without becoming a party to facilitating interest for our clients and for our customers. So we are able to do it, but the first step in that direction is to recognize, number one, and not to justify, to acknowledge that, look, if we are involved in it, then let's not justify. Let's acknowledge that what we are doing is wrong, it's incorrect. And diagnosis of a sickness is you've already traversed half the road to treatment and shifa and cure if you diagnose the sickness. But if you don't diagnose the sickness and we try and justify our acts, then of course we are not going to move forward in the path. So to recognize the fact that interest has been prohibited in no uncertain terms, very stern and severe warnings have been sounded upon it. This is something that we need to embrace, we need to understand. A brief there's different types of interest in the Quran, in the Hadith, but a brief definition of the word interest that we can take to heart and understand is what the fuqaha and the jurists have mentioned, that kullu qardin jarra manfa'atan fahuwa riban. Every loan that is advanced and it generates a benefit over and above the principal sum of the loan, and the fuqaha speak about it as a benefit. That benefit can be monetary or otherwise. It can be cash or in kind. This is termed as interest. So the jurists say that let's assume I give a loan to someone, and we don't have a relationship where I ever used to, ask you for a loan, travel with you, go ask you for a lift or anything of that nature. But today, because I gave you a loan, Moulana, I'm now asking you that please can you give me a lift to my house? And you feel obliged that, he has given me a loan, let me give him a lift, let me take him home. It's out of the way a little bit, but let me do that. So this benefit that I have generated is actually a form of interest.
Right.
And it falls under the category. So every loan, kullu qardin jarra manfa'atan, every loan that draws a benefit over and above the capital sum, that benefit can be in cash or in kind, is actually riba and interest, and that is something that we need to be aware about.
Sab, you also use the term gharar. Can you explain that to us?
So gharar is also a very important Islamic economic or commercial principle, and that is gharar refers to uncertainty. Uncertainty in outcome. And there has been so much that has been written on gharar itself. I read a book once, and we were actually reviewing that book that was written by a great Sudanese scholar, Sheikh Siddiq Al-Amin Al-Darir. And the title of that book was Al-Gharar wa Atharuhu fil Uqud, Gharar and its effects on contracts. The effect that gharar has on commercial contracts is different from the effect that gharar has on non-commercial contracts. So if there is a commercial contract, our deen and our jurisprudence requires of us that there must be no gharar that can lead to uncertainty, no gharar or uncertainty that can lead to dispute. The fuqaha and the jurists use a term, al-mufdi ila al-munaza'a. There must be no gharar and uncertainty in a bilateral commercial contract that can lead to dispute. And therefore, our contracts should be free of that, and our contracts will be free from that when we follow certain guidelines of our commercial law. For example, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam said that Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam an bay'i ma lam yamlik. Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam has prohibited selling something that you don't own. You can't sell it as though it's your own. Something that you don't own, you can't. You can sell it as a broker, as an agent, that's separate. But something that you haven't owned, you don't own at the moment, you can't sell. Because why? Because there's uncertainty in whether you will be able to deliver it or not. So, for example, the people of Jahiliyyah, the people in the past, in the times of pre-Islamic era, they used to sell certain items that they didn't yet have ownership over. So they used to sell the fetus of an unborn camel, for example. Mm-hmm. And they would sell that fetus of the unborn camel. And Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam prohibited it. Why? Because we did not know. There was uncertainty in outcome. They would go a step further and they would sell the fetus of that animal, because they would give so much of importance to bloodline and lineage in animals that they would go a step further and actually try and sell the fetus of the unborn animal. So there's gharar in that, there's uncertainty in that. Now there's a lot of instances where gharar applies in our businesses as well, and we need to identify those. There may not be time to go into the great details, but one of the other aspects that Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam guided us towards to protect us from entering into a gharar-based transaction or speculative transaction is that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam an bay'i ma lam yaqbid. He has prohibited us from selling something that we may own but we don't have possession of. So we might have done a deal, we've exchanged offer and acceptance, but we haven't received possession of that item, either physically or constructively, haqiqatan or hukman. We haven't received possession of that item. We are not allowed to sell that item onwards because there's an element of gharar. There's uncertainty about whether we will be able to deliver on it or not. Risk hasn't yet transferred because risk transfers on possession. Ownership transfers with offer and acceptance, and risk transfers with possession. So until we don't have possession, either physically or constructively, we cannot transfer that item and sell it onwards. So that's another aspect where that we need to be aware about, and to ensure that there is no gharar and uncertainty in those transactions. Another aspect, for example, is conventional insurance contracts. You enter, it's a bilateral commercial contract in which I transfer my risk to someone else and pay him a fee for that, and he takes over that. But whether I'll be able to benefit from that or not, or I'll just keep on paying premiums and I won't have the opportunity to ever make a claim, that is uncertain. And that's a major reason why conventional insurance contracts are not permissible, because there is gharar and uncertainty in a bilateral commercial contract. So those were some of the aspects, Moulana, that on which we can touch on, gharar and uncertainty.
So when it comes to Islamic banking, what makes Islamic banking different from conventional banking? Sometimes people look at the rate of interest and the rate of profit, and they say, well, it's more or less the same. What's the difference here? How would you define Islamic banking versus conventional banking? What are the distinguishing factors?
The reality is that there is a world of difference. It's completely different aspects. And maybe I want to touch on a verse that we spoke about previously in one of the beginning discussions, and that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish those who are the consumers of interest. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then speaks about it, and He says, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا. And that is because these people used to say that buying and selling is just like riba and interest. Buying and selling a commodity is just like buying and selling money. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed you to buy and sell commodities on credit at a profit, but He has not allowed you to buy and sell money on credit at a profit. So, when we make these utterances and these comments that Islamic banking is the same as conventional banking, sometimes I feel that it's actually a very dangerous statement. It's something very similar to what the people of Jahiliyyah were actually saying, that Islamic banking is the same as conventional banking, because they also said, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَى. So just because the end result of something is the same, or the rate of sale of something is the same, it does not make the two transactions the same. And that is something that we need to be aware about. We need to take cognizance and note of, that just because two things are the same, it does not make them the same. And maybe I want to draw the attention of our viewers to some examples in this regard, in day-to-day life. So I take a chicken, I recite Bismillah, and I slaughter that chicken, and we skin it, and we hang it upside down. And then there is another person who is a non-Muslim. He's not even from the Ahl Kitab. If someone were to say Ahl Kitab, he's not even from the Ahl Kitab. He takes a chicken, he slaughters it. Of course, he doesn't recite the name of Allah on it, and he skins it and he hangs it upside down. Can you tell the difference between the two chickens? You simply can't. Both of them look the same, they may taste the same, everything is the same, but one is halal and the other is haram. And the reason is because of the procedure that was adopted in making the one halal. So that made all the difference between halal and haram. Let's assume, I'll go to another example perhaps. Let's assume I exchange vows. I offer to marry a woman in the presence of two witnesses, and that woman accepts, or her representative accepts, to marry me in the presence of witnesses. And we are staying at a certain location, and after 10 years we have 3 or 4 children. And right next door to us there is another couple who haven't exchanged vows formally, but they've agreed to live a life of loyalty with each other. And after 10 years they also have 3 or 4 children. Now, just because the end result is the same, does it make both of our lives the same? No. One is living a life of chastity, a life of an enviable life of marriage, and the other is living a life out of wedlock. Now, just because the end result was the same, can we ever, in our wildest dreams, say that both transactions are the same? Yeah. And we learn this actually from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam was once offered dates. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam looked at the dates and he said that to the Sahabi, he said, "Where did you get these dates from?" He said, "I got them from Khaybar, so north of Medina." So he said, "Akullu tamari Khaybar hakada? Are all the dates of Khaybar like these dates?" He said, "No." He said, "Then how did you get them?" So the Sahabi says, "I exchanged 2 saw." Saw was a measure in those times. Let's assume 2 kilos, just for purposes of understanding. So I exchanged 2 kilos of inferior quality dates for a kilo of superior quality dates. And Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam said to the Sahabi, "Uffu aynur riba." This was a transaction which was actually a usurious transaction. I don't want to go into the details of that, but we're not supposed to be selling items which are homogeneous in nature, which are sold by weight or measure in different quantities, irrespective of the quality, and it's a type of riba and interest. And Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam said this to the Sahabi. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't stop there. He said what you should have done was, you should have sold your 2 sa' for a dirham, and then you should have used that dirham to purchase the 1 sa'. Now, that Sahabi could have done that transaction with the very same person who he was transacting with, and the end result would have been the same. But it was the procedure that made the difference between halal and haram, and that is something that we need to be aware about, and that is something that is very key. So the key difference between Islamic banking and conventional banking is that Islamic banking is based on the principles of trade. It adheres to the laws of trade and to the laws of commercial principles that has been expounded in the Quran, in the Hadith, by the scholars of fiqh, etc. Whereas conventional financing, whatever type of financing it might be, whether it's educational finance, whether it's home financing, whether it's trade financing, whether it's personal finance, every one of those financing transactions in the commercial space is based upon a loan on interest. And Islamic finance is not that. Islamic finance is based on the laws of trade and commerce. And therefore, it is asset-backed financing. There must be assets that are there. You must follow the procedures that have to be followed. So the Islamic bank would buy, very, very briefly perhaps, just for the benefit of the viewers, a very simple example would be that you go to an Islamic bank, you ask them for a loan, they will tell you that we do not give loans. What we can do is provide finance. Why do you need the money? So I need to buy a vehicle. They will say to you that, look, we'll buy the vehicle and we'll sell it to you on credit at a profit. That's one very basic principle. So they don't give you a loan. They buy the vehicle either themselves or through your agency. They will appoint you, and the documentation stipulates that we will appoint you as an agent to buy that vehicle, and then we will sell it to you on credit over a period of time. So this is a very basic sort of outline on these concepts.
Of course, Mufti Sahib, there's much more detail, and time is against us. But taking this concept now, how does it tie up fundamentally with the core of how car dealers do their business? Especially when it comes to car financing and the conventional transactions versus now the Sharia compliant transactions.
So I want to we'll speak about the car dealers, but just generally as Muslim businessmen, we need to learn the rules of trade. And if this program can create a bit of awareness in that light, then I think we have moved on in a very successful way. So Hazrat Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he would walk around the streets of Medina and he would ask traders and business people that, have you learned the rules of trade? And if they were to reply in the negative, then he would ask them to shut their businesses down, go and learn the rules of trade, particular to their form of business, and come back and then trade in that particular manner. So this is a very important aspect. When it comes to car dealers or any other fraternity of business for that matter, we must learn our rules of trade. How does it affect us? First of all, we must understand that we have guidelines as Muslims on how we are to trade. Our trading activity is not divorced from our religion. In fact, it's very much part of our religion and our spirituality and our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When it comes to car dealers, and it may apply to other aspects as well, in as far as car dealers are concerned, one of the major aspects that is found actually, and I don't say it to take out fault, but to identify an issue that we can, as scholars and ulama, and as the business fraternity, perhaps work together to try and resolve. Because when we work together, inshallah, we can make a difference going forward. One of the major issues and challenges that car dealers are faced with is the aspect that people don't generally buy vehicles on cash. They acquire finance for those vehicles. And most of the time, they don't source that finance themselves. Finance is available on the car dealer's showroom floor. It's available there. Now, the issue is and there are representatives of those of financing houses, and many a times it's of conventional financing houses that are there to provide finance for the clients of these car dealers. So the car dealers say that, look, we are not taking the finance. It's our clients who are taking the finance. But the problem is that we are facilitating that process in a very sort of direct manner. We have facilitated for these financiers or their representatives to sit on our floor and to arrange this finance. We provide documentation to them. In instances, we may be signing off on that documentation. And as we discussed in the discussion on riba and interest, we become a sort of, a party to the transaction as a witness or as a facilitator, and that is problematic. To take it even further, car dealers also get a kickback from the financing houses, a once-off kickback, and car dealers will be familiar with this concept, that, you know what, if there is, you get a certain amount of money back into your account as a kickback or brokerage or an agency fee for actually arranging and facilitating this finance. Now, in my understanding and the understanding of many scholars, this is problematic because you are earning out of facilitating an interest-based transaction. And this is problematic. But of course, together with mentioning the issue, the problem at hand, because I truly believe that as scholars, we are to give solutions and not only to identify problems. I believe that we must sit together, form an association of Muslim car dealers. And when we speak together in one voice, we will be able to make a difference. We will be able to ensure, for example, that any finance that is available on our floor will be Islamic finance. In our situation and scenario in South Africa, we are very fortunate that most of the big banks have got Islamic finance alternatives. So when that is there, we should be able to limit our financing to and facilitating of finance to only Islamic-based transactions. And when we do, if there are challenges in that regard, if there are rate differences in that regard, then all of that needs to be documented. It needs to come to the fore, and we must speak as an association and make a difference in that regard. And by doing that, inshallah, we will go a great step forward in sort of working towards purifying our income and our earnings even further, and acting upon the advices of and the guidelines of the Sharia that we spoke about in the beginning.
Jazakumullah so much for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion. Like I said in my introduction, we don't often have these discussions on this particular platform, and we really appreciate that you've availed of your time and you've joined us. Of course, we couldn't do justice to the topic, but at least it just initiates some thought and some understanding in this regard. And hopefully, in the near future, we'll be able to take the discussion further, inshallah.
Inshallah. I believe we should have a discussion for various types of trading activities, so manufacturing areas, trading areas, import, export. These are all aspects that have their own peculiar guidelines, and the Muslim community requires guidance on all of these aspects. Jazakallah, Moulana, for having me on the program and for taking this very important initiative. Jazakallah.
Barakallah feek. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Well, viewers, there you have it. It's Mufti Shafique Jakhura who was with us on the program today, focusing on Islamic economic principles. And towards the end, we were talking a little bit about that which is relevant in terms of Islamic economic principles to car dealers. Fascinating. I know it may be a little technical here and there, but it's very important because, like Mufti Sahib also explained right in the beginning of the discussion, that each one of us has to trade in some way or the other, even if you're not formally in business. You have to buy, you have to sell, you have to get some finance when you have to purchase a vehicle, purchase a house, you've got to transact and you've got to understand how these things happen. So we will put this up as a podcast on the YouTube channel as well. And I strongly encourage you that, because we're not so familiar with these concepts, maybe watch it a second time and a third time until you're able to digest and try and learn a little bit more about it. But we're always thankful to Mufti Shafique Jakhura sahab for always availing himself. Until next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.